you can't cut your way to growth, generally speaking. I mean, you can definitely cut yourself to sort of limping along, but you can't necessarily cut your way to growth.
A lot of retailers out there have been pushing one mantra, customer experience. I struggled with that because I always said, okay, so what is your customer experience?
When we think about the big challenge of becoming better storied, we may have a flip charts and a great discussions at the C-suite, philosophizing what this great experience might look like. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newbury. I'm an award-winning strategic advisor and delivery executive. I'm focused on the rapid transformation of disrupted supply chain performance across the make, move, sell flow of consumer products and services from production to porch and assembly floor to shelf. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt, and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available from my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check these out. As the business world faces significant volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, business leaders looking to drive market-leading performance need to be tapping into thought leaders, strategic advisors, and implementation executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations, together with a strong track record of transitioning enterprises to become more agile, innovative, and digital. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started. Welcome everybody. I have Jeff and George joining me, and I'm going to ask them to give a quick introduction to themselves.
George Minakakis. I run a firm called Inception Retail Group. It's a party of one and anyone else who joins me on different projects. Primarily, I work with private equity firms as a CEO partner and advisor, but every now and then I show up at a private equity deal as an investor, surprise, surprise, and they do everything they can to stop me from getting into the deal. I also written 3 books, I whispered to Gary and told him I'm writing a 4th one, but he's going to be surprised it'll be different. And retailing, I worked for Luxottica for 20 years and for PepsiCo for several years. So it's been a consumer-facing business world for me for a better part of 30 years anyway.
Thanks, George. Jeff?
Jeff Roberts, American by birth, but I'm based out of London now, have been for the past 20 years. Background-wise, I'm a strategy consultant. I've worked both in consulting and in-house roles, primarily been focused retail and consumer products for the vast majority of my career.
Recently, I was reading through, weirdly, Steve Dennis's book, which has taken me nearly 2 years to get to the back cover, and I'm still copiously working through it. And I passed through a chapter where he was describing a situation of the often go-to for retail chains facing a downturn in the economy, the rush to closing stores as a solution to reducing their cost base. And he was proposing perhaps that if you have a mediocre offer, closing stores isn't going to change that mediocre offer. There has to be perhaps something more that has to be put into the pot. Around the same time as I was reading that, Simeon Sigel, who appeared on this channel several times, revealed on one of the financial channels that he was being interviewed on, maybe CNBC or whatever it was, that he'd done a similar research like he did with a D2C. When his team had researched many chains over a period of time that had gone into 10-20% store reductions, they hadn't actually moved the needle on the bottom line. In fact, maybe they'd made things worse. So my statement here is, when we face a situation, we've got these choices: do we cut stores or do something else? So the proposition I have, or the rebuttal to the go-to strategy of closing stores is, are we overstored or understoried? So I'd like to explore that to see, is there alternatives here that retailers could look at that would be very timely for them to hear at this point in time as they face big challenges of 2023?
Let me just start by saying that I don't necessarily agree with that theory, because having run businesses, I will tell you that because someone closed stores doesn't mean that they did it the right way. It doesn't mean that they've actually reached out to their past customers and have moved traffic back to other locations. Sometimes when you have too many stores, you're cannibalizing your profitability a great deal. And the reason a lot of retailers end up with a lot of stores, more than they want, is because when you want to get into Yorkdale Mall or any high-end mall in the US, and if it's a bigger operator, you're going to have to take a C store somewhere as well in order to get that A store. And that just happens a lot. What you end up doing is it might spend $1 million opening an A volume store, an A volume mall versus spending maybe $300,000 to open a store in a C volume mall. But still, those stores don't actually do very well, even if you spent less money, and you're not even really breaking even a lot of them, because they're in marketplaces that lack traffic. And the reason they lack traffic is because most of the people that live in that community are commuters, and the commuters don't necessarily shop local. So you've ended up with a store that's not delivering profitability. If you're going to close that store, what you end up doing is you're reaching out to that customer base and you're telling them that you're relocating the store and here's some other options you can go to. And you keep engaging those customers. If you're not seeing the profitability or the transfer of that volume, then I would say to you that those retailers are not doing a good job in managing their customer base.
It's an interesting one, because I think a lot of the times when cost cutting comes in to a program, it tends to be something that's oftentimes quite reactive and is thought through as let's capture whatever we can see. And so that's why, I mean, I know when I was in-house, when they came down to cost-cutting exercises, there were always things around, well, let's review mobile phone bills. Let's have a look at air travel, things that were obviously easy to pick out to say that that's something that we think we can actively manage. And I think, very much as what George said, it's about really understanding how your business makes money in the round. So where are the things looking? And because obviously, and George makes a great point, is that oftentimes when you have to make location strategy decisions, you have to take the good with the bad with that. And so, but it's the same idea that you would think when you think about the business from a cost reduction perspective. What's the whole thing that's happening? Where are there things how do we make money to begin with? Where are there things, the trade-offs that are required to hold the high volume stores? And does that justify the management of the low? Looking at it in the round, I think ultimately is what I'm trying to say, is that it tends to be one of those things that you capture the easily available things that, we can reduce that, or we can pull on that without necessarily understanding either how the pieces were put together. So oftentimes the ties aren't necessarily linearly connected across the piece, but also how are the pieces held together for, say, the revenue generating side or the better revenue generating sides that you can capture that might be reliant on having the ones that perhaps weren't that great to begin with. They came as a package deal. I think that's hugely important.
As we look at 2023, we've seen massive consumer behavior changes during the pandemic. We had to change channel, category spend and volume. Now we're going into the hard phase of the cost of living crisis, and people are really now adjusting everything to what they're facing in terms of rising interest rates, property costs, and they haven't quite factored in we'll have a job later this year, still yet to wind into their thinking. If that's the case, and we think that we've got a fairly good proposition, we survived the pandemic somehow, I know the natural thing is to say, right, let's pick up some cost items and just put a red pen through them. But where is the thought that says we need to change something here? And that might actually, in the short term, in our current cost modeling, it might actually increase our costs as opposed to improve them. But in the longer term, we may actually survive this new threat to our very existence. And what might that look like in terms of our marketplace? So where are the opportunities? What capabilities do we have to establish and start utilizing? And what's our story? What does our story need to be in 2023 that looks different to the last couple of years?
The challenge in 2023 is just how to remain relevant and draw traffic to stay in business. It's going to be the challenge. I don't know. After Christmas, I suspect things, if they're already slow, they're just going to get tougher. And I believe that the mentality in retailers right now is how am I going to drive traffic and capture revenue? There's this thing called buy now, pay later. And I really believe that is going to be a significant part of what retailers use to drive revenue. they're not going to care if you have no cash, and these buy now, pay later initiatives that are out there don't necessarily, impact you. That they're not looking for excellent credit either, right? It's basically a layaway plan where you take away the product right away. So retailers need a vehicle, and that's the one that they're going to be able to use. Now, will the consumers be, will they bite on that? It all depends on their financial means. Those that want things, not necessarily need them, but want them, and have no budget, they'll probably try. But I think there's fewer of them. When I add in mortgage interest rates going up, and if your mortgage opens up, you're actually doubling, in some cases doubling your payments. That's different. And I think, Gary, I shared with you a long time ago that my dad used to tell me that 1 week's paycheck used to pay the rent for the apartment. And today, I think 1 month's paycheck, it made me just barely cover the apartment. I think the dynamics have changed a great deal with consumers. So I'm not convinced that it's going to be easy. I just think it's going to be a very hard time. And I do believe you will see more store closures. That purging is not done yet, because the days of beating your fist on your chest that I have 500 stores, great. Now it's going to be, God, I have 500 stores. I need to get down to 400. And that is a reality. I think that's coming to fruition. So I don't agree with the thoughts earlier, but people how they're positioning on it. But I do believe that 2023 is going to be a catalyst year. Again, how do I become leaner? How do I stay profitable? How do I stay in business long enough to get through 2023 and maybe through 2024 to get to where we come out of this, into this V, and out of a recession, because that's coming. So I believe that that's the mentality in a retailer's recession right now is, how do I stay in business? How do I keep the lights on and doors open?
As a corollary to that, it's really about understanding where you play. And so I think that's one of the big things that a lot of retailers, it's funny you mentioned Steve Dennis to start off with, and I think that's the great point of the book, right? Is that fundamentally, if you have a mediocre offer, it sort of doesn't matter where you're placed. And so I think the idea there fundamentally is to say, where do we make money? How do we make money? What are the things that are required, to tie us in for, say, fixed parts of the cost base that we can't necessarily shift? But what are the things that we can think about where we position ourselves, and who's the buyer for that? What do they look like? So my team, for example, we run a lot of computational simulations, right? So we grow artificial worlds, sort of see what dynamics play out. And so one of the things that we've been playing around with is sort of, because you learn from extreme cases, we've been playing around with sort of what would happen in a degrowth context, for example, right? So let's say somebody goes hard in on a degrowth model. And what we actually started run after a few 100,000 runs of it is that what we repeatedly see is that the biggest advice that you would give to anybody is premiumize your offer as quickly as possible. Because when we tied out to a couple of different geographies, we're looking in places across North America and places across Europe, we were just using sort of wealth and income distributions to get an idea of how consumers behave in those models. The quickest things we saw were that you see a rush for those at the higher end of the distribution get served more readily, and they have a longer lifespan across the model as a result of that. So I think it's an interesting thing to really understand two things, right? So where do you play? So what's your actual dynamics of your store? What's the offer that's there, irrespective of, say, the fixed cost base of the store, et cetera. And then also, are you in a position to do something with it? So what's the outside world signaling to you? So not only can we expect changes in consumer behavior, we know that those changes aren't necessarily consistent across, it's the consumer is a generic item, right? So being able to come through and say, actually, who is it we service? Is there an opportunity to expand into servicing a different group? And if not, as around finding the opportunities to either gravitate where you think you can, right? So we, obviously we've seen discounters do really well, particularly in the UK, continuing to do really well. But I think it's sort of overlooked that thinking about different ways of positioning it, it's well, to steal from Steve Dennis's argument, right? It's that mediocre middle that you want to avoid at any and all cost.
Jeff, I agree with you. Those are great points. And at the end of the day, I know that the last 5 years, 7 years, a lot of retailers out there have been pushing one mantra: customer experience. I struggled with that because I always said, okay, so what is your customer experience? How do you develop it? How do you deliver it? How do you keep it consistent from one store to the other? Well, that's not important. The fact that everybody knows what we should be doing, we allow their own freestyle. That doesn't work. It doesn't fly very well, and it's not consistent, right? So I agree with what you're saying, and it is, the middle can be mediocre. When I ran LensCrafters, it was a brand that was highly disciplined. We trained our staff, and we spent millions of dollars training. it was important to us. That's how you make a brand consistent. But when I look at other organizations that I poked into, with private equity, what do you think, George? Oh, brand is broken. They have no processes. They have no systems in place to train people. You have founders who tell you, gee, this whole thing has been built around me. And if I leave, it all falls apart. And it's clearly reality, right? Now, the PEs think that they can take over a brand and professionalize it and it will change. I'd say to you, it's kind of dangerous to actually take the founder out sometimes, even if it's broken, because it'll just get worse. And so at that point, you don't want to invest, but you got to invest in, if you're going to stay in the marketplace and you're going to be location by location, yes, from a merchandising point of view, you got to be very smart about it, right? Carrying the same inventory in Vancouver, which is a strong Asian population, versus Montreal doesn't work, right? You got to customize it as much as you can. And that is just a fact of life. And even the pricing strategies can change, right? You end up using a dynamic pricing model where you say, look, I can get away with this price point for this sweater in BC versus what I can do in Newfoundland. That's just reality. And if you're intelligent enough in your organization, you're going to do the right things from a pricing and merchandising point of view to get to win locally. But winning locally also means that you're going to give your staff the opportunity to customize the experience with the customer. And if you're not doing that, what experience are you delivering, right? There is no wow factor. Somebody tried to convince me one day, oh, George, the wow factor is in the package being delivered to the door. That is not a wow factor. I mean, that's like saying we should applaud the pilot for landing the plane. That's just not the way it is. And what we have to do is we have to go outside that box and say, okay, well, how much empowerment am I going to give these employees, the staff in each store, to drive this experience so that I can actually do something of value? Because when there's a downturn, that is the opportunity to shift gears and improve your operations and elevate service. But you've got to invest in it, and you've got to be very tactical and detailed with your staff that here's the steps that we're going to do to deliver it and to make it work. So if you want to stop closing stores, you got to have a high level of confidence that what you're doing from a product point of view, pricing, and the value proposition that you deliver in the store are consistent. Otherwise, you're closing stores.
I'm glad you brought up the customer experience, because I had to pop it into my local mobility provider to keep my name out of the equation. And it took about an hour for him to transfer one phone to another. So I got talking to him and I said, he was a very chatty guy, and I asked him what training did he have in this store about the products, all the different cell phones and packaging, etc. And I just had to kind of ask questions and try and figure it out. So it was clearly, in one of our prime mobility providers, there was clearly no established plan to train people. He then went on and explored, worked for sporting goods, who we both know. He repeated exactly the same point, that he was only there part-time, it was 4 hours a day or something like that, 5 days a week. And there was no formal training program for him. He had to scoot around, ask questions. He landed in footwear. And so he kind of explored lots of different options around footwear, but he wasn't formally trained in the solutions that these different footwear products were providing. Is it a surprise that most of our retailers are in that mediocre category? Because when you walk into a store, it's sometimes hard to find a store associate. And when you ask them a question, they sort of say it's aisle 32, whatever it is, and just get out of my way, I'm filling shelves or whatever it is. So when we think about the big challenge of becoming better storied, we may have a flip charts and a great discussions at the C-suite, philosophizing what this great experience might look like. But when we go down to the cold face, we can find very clearly that isn't manifesting itself in the detail of a proposition that we expected to deliver to the consumer. So maybe closing stores might be the answer, because what else can we do? And it's really this discussion is about what else can we do. We can look at where our market is and try and be better at that. But if in the past we've done all those exercises and we've ended up with an outcome. We have untrained store associates running right out of our stores, interfacing with some of our gold LTV customers and basically pissing them off. How do we change our thinking from getting off a flip chart and actually translating that into something that the customer can understand, can recognize store to store, and then know that whether or not it's on the e-commerce channel, in our store, in an adjacent store in a different town, they understand what they're getting. Because if we know what that level playing field is, we know that we can elevate it to respond to whatever challenge we have. And we've got currently a cost of living challenge, which will affect consumers' budgets. But if we don't have that basic principle in place, what hope is there? I shouldn't say it knows where, but what hope really is there?
I think one of the big challenges that I come across, or have historically come across, and this isn't unique to retail, this is more or less anyone, is that somewhat misunderstanding who your actual competitor is, and then subsequently seeking to model the way that your store or customer experience is because of you don't necessarily understand who you're in competition with. So I think the classic for this has always been, well, we have to offer free shipping because look at how that goes, great guns for Amazon. We've got to compete with that level. And then it's not really about understanding, well, actually, are you in competition with Amazon? And not only that, is there something that you can do? Is that the point of differentiation? As cliched as that sounds, but is that the point of differentiation that any consumer is coming to you for, or any customers is arriving in the store for? Is it because that you were able to meet on price, whatever the case may be? Whereas there's the opportunity to compete on the experience. Your footwear example, for instance, is there something there that I go to this location because I get A, B, and C, versus I'm just going on price? And it's not just about understanding. I mean, partially it's a case of understanding who your actual consumer is at the end of the chain, and understanding what the expectations are embedded into what they're looking for in experience. So someone who's going to a discounter, for example, isn't necessarily there for top-notch merchandising and for product advice, right? You're there because you want to be able to get something cheap and get it in and out quickly. And if you're in a different experience, sort of knowing what that looks like. So I think it's not necessarily around one solution for everyone, but it's around understanding two things, right? So ultimately, who are you trying to serve? Like, what's the ultimate goal there? But then secondly, who are you competing with in meeting that need? And at what time? So if we think about it, we know that the demands and expectations of what you're doing might change over the course of the day, over the course of the week, month, year, etc. And so who are you actually in competition with at that particular sort of temporal frame? And is shipping, we can see shipping, free shipping, thankfully, sort of slowly starting to die a death with the cost of returns. No bad thing there. The idea being is that are you actually competing on it? Just because they're well known and they're large and you've heard of them, that's not necessarily the reason that they were there. Like the lens crafters discussion, George. Like when I was still living in America, right? You went to lens crafters because you knew it was going to be selection, it was going to be fast, and ideally you got your glasses really quickly. Someone wears glasses, which was a huge draw, right? And it was great that they were in every mall and you could show up, and it was something that you knew you were taking care of. See, I don't think personally, as a consumer, I wouldn't look at, say, Warby Parker as a competitor necessarily there, right? Because I'm going for different reasons while I'm going for these, and we see the struggles they're having. But the idea of really around understanding who you're in competition with, and then actually taking and having an honest conversation, it's one of the hardest things to do most senior levels, but having a truly honest conversation around who you're actually competing with, and then because that helps to open up the spectrum of what actually do we need to do to frame this thing appropriately with who we actually trying to reach, and then how we stand out against who we're actually in competition with.
I agree with that. I'm going to tell you a real quick story just to make you laugh. Years ago, we had a 13-year-old in the house, and he was graduating out of middle school, and we had to get a suit for him. Of course, so he's growing fast, and we knew the suit wasn't going to last very long. But so we ended up at this men's store, and they've got this loud music playing, and it's almost like a discotheque. I mean, it really was dated. And we're talking to the salesperson. The music's pretty loud, and my son and my wife are with me, and the associate's trying to talk to us to help us find a suit for him. I thought it was pretty good because he knows product, he knows how to size them up and everything, and so it was good. Then the manager comes over and ruins things, because he pulls the guy over and says, "Hey, and I heard him. He said, look, part of the new customer experience is that we need to be dancing and waving to the music that we're playing." And so here's this, middle-aged guy, right? And he goes, "I'm sorry, folks." Then he starts snapping his fingers, starts moving around. I tell him, "You know what? Can we just stop this piece for now? Because I need you to stay steady so I can actually pay attention to you, because the music's so loud, I can barely hear you anyway, right? And then, so we got the suit sorted out and everything, and he got the cash, and the manager says, how was your experience? And I said, you know what? I have to tell you how my experience was. And I told him who I was and what I did. And he goes, oh. And I said, I have to tell you. I said, here's my card. If your president wants to call me, they can. But I just got to tell you, this is the dumbest idea I have ever seen in my life. And I never got a call. But I remember a few weeks later, I was visiting some stores in the mall, and the music had stopped. They weren't playing anymore. I don't think it was me, but hopefully somebody realized this is a stupid idea. But to your point, Jeff, about who's your customer, who is your competition, right? I didn't go by any competitors who were playing music that you had to worry about, right? This was really about, it was about fashion, and had to fit, and had to be good quality, and value proposition that you've taken that works well, right? With the customer base you're targeting. If you thought that the music was going to make all the difference, right? I have news for you. And your employees swaying side to side, no, that's not it. It's really about the personal touches, right? That drive the customer experience in the stores. It's something that you can teach, but you have to allow the employee to come to life and be more animated by themselves. And you just tell them you have to cover all these steps in order to execute. But at the end of the day, I just think a lot of retailers struggle with who's my customer, who's my competitor, and how do I reach and differentiate myself from everybody else. I think they just struggle, and they're going to continue for some time.
That's what I love about that story, because what they completely missed is that this is a store that's probably going to have someone's parents come in to buy their kid the first suit. So that's the people you really need to be focused on, making sure they have a great experience. Teenagers are too. So, I mean, they grow like weeds. And so if you have to buy something like that, you're like, oh, God, right, I'm going to be back in 6 months. Like, please don't let there be another event, because I'm going to have to come back in 6 months and get this. But that's exactly right. Is to actually say that actually it's not just the fact that we carry a range that fits this size. So therefore, that's the demographic going through, which tends to be the pretty obvious. But it's the midst of the fact, well, actually, this is an occasion. And the person who's, they're not the buyer, right? You're the buyer. And last thing you want is to have to shout to be like, can we go up a size while you're trying to in there? And it's a fundamental flaw, I think.
Or break out into a dance myself in the middle of the store.
It would be something, wouldn't it?
I think I probably could have single-handedly ended music in the store if the customers were required to dance as well. So I mean that would have been a surefire end to that. That would have stopped just purely one moment I walked in.
It wouldn't have happened even if you said it was free. I wouldn't have done it.
So we exploring, and I'm sure we're pushing the boundaries out of where this discussion might end up. And I'm happy to continue with this whole theme of, are we overstored or understoried? But are there any key thoughts that have emerged already from this discussion? One for me is, if we're unclear about what the proposition really is at the coalface, we stand to have a very difficult task of elevating that to something which might be highly relevant for the kind of reshaping consumer. So the answer for me is, maybe it is about, where does marketing fit into all this discussion? We may have a podcast for that coming out in the next few weeks, but I think retailers have to really learn something about where they are with a view before they make that decision, like to just slash 20% of the stores. So don't worry, the e-commerce site will pick up the slack. And there's some big implications of that for, if I'm a regular shopper at that store, what's happening? They've closed the store. I used to go there every time. No, I'm not going to another town to, that I'm definitely not going to use a website because I go to a store. Otherwise, I would have already been using a website. So I think there's some serious thought, and call it an honest conversation, Jeff. I think there's some really serious, deep thinking by retailers before they press that button. To, if CFO gets excited and gets exercised with his red pen to say, right, let's slash some stuff, let's save this business somehow. I think that we can look to save a retailer in a different way than just looking at costs. And we must start to think about the consumer, where they're going, and how fit and capable are we at moving in front of them to help guide their journey over the next year, 2 years towards 2025.
think it's around looking at it in the whole, right? And I think this is one of the big things. It's oftentimes, I say this is early in my career, I used to do a lot of cost cutting work, and it was soul destroying, because you'd come in and you could see that basically we were pulling on threads. The bad analogy or metaphor I used to always use was, it's like grabbing a thread on the edge of your sweater, and you're pulling, and you're just watching it nicely unravel, and then suddenly the left arm falls off because something that was connected in a way that you didn't realize was connected, you've severed through it. And this is sort of when you start, and then that's when you see the rapid cascades of something terrible happening. I think you're spot on, is that marketing fundamentally has to be involved in this, and it has to be you can't cut your way to growth, generally speaking. I mean, you can definitely cut yourself to sort of limping along, but you can't necessarily cut your way to growth. And I think if I think about a great UK example recently, like I've been blown away by Marks and Spencer's transformation in the UK, right? I mean, that was a company that had grown incredibly tired and had made some pretty big missteps as a result. And what I think they did was, I mean, they haven't gotten everything right, but they've done some really good stuff. And what that I think is really around understanding, really starting with the proposition. They saw that they were making shed loads of money in food, and there was a real review on the food side of things. It was around moving talent around inside the business to say, right, well, you're able to do that. Maybe we can bring some of the magic. They're close enough categories. Maybe we can bring some of that over. And then looking more broadly is to say, okay, well, what can we do to actually create an experience, that someone wants to come, and really understanding why people were coming to Marks and Spencer's in the first place, and then what was the demand for that? Because I mean, I can remember when I first moved to the UK, and the whole drive, I remember them saying, "Oh, we're gonna start chasing younger consumers, particularly women." And they were like, "Right, we're gonna launch Peruna." There was a younger positioning, a younger brand positioned towards younger, particularly female customers, that they were going for, and it just didn't land because everything wrapped around it was still selling to me, basically middle-aged jumper wearers who wanted to come in and do that. So the idea of really trying to just launch in piecemeal without actually saying what's the totality of the thing that's here, and how can we meet the events that you're coming in for, in a department store in particular, what kind of events would you be showing up for, and then how can we create something that's enticing, that helps you learn something about it, that's the appropriate price point, that is actually useful to come here versus somewhere else. But to do that, I think you have to look at it in the whole. And I think that's the real problem. I mean, fundamentally, yeah, you got to have to cut some stores sometimes. That's the sad reality of life, that happens. But looking at the cost base and thinking that pushing that particular button repeatedly will suddenly change everything is obviously a fool's errand. And I know it's never as explicitly simplistic as that. But I've worked in a lot of places where it feels awfully close to that. If we just keep cutting, something good will magically happen. And it doesn't.
Jeff, you're right. It doesn't happen. For me, the retailers that I know of out here, I would have to say they need to get out of their silos, particularly marketing. If you want to enhance the value proposition, create a better customer experience, and also develop the brand to a point where you're innovating inside the store as well, right? And I cannot remember the name of the brand that I saw in Australia a few years ago, but I was blown away by the merchandising. Just the way they displayed product. It was all a women's store, but the way they displayed things, well, I was fascinated by it. And I just never seen it done that way in Canada, or the US for that matter. At the end of the day, though, marketers need to get out of their silos. So do the merchandisers, by the way, and get down to the stores and listen to the employees that work in the stores, and listen to the customers, that get a better, fresher look at what's going on there, and do market research, understand how consumer sees the stores in the venue that they're in. Maybe you shouldn't be in malls. Maybe your store needs to relocate itself to an open air center, right? Maybe you can conglomerate 2 or 3 stores into one larger location somewhere. I mean, there are a lot of things that you need to be open-minded about, but it's a holistic approach to this. And unfortunately, I don't believe that's how it works. There are people who operate in silos, and it's not their fault. It's just the nature of the culture. But if you want to change the dynamic and not be pressing that button all the time and hope for something different to change, you need to spend the time and the resources up at the front line. And if you've got a plan at that point that says, I need to find a way to save $1 million to execute this plan, and if I can close these stores, I will generate that. I will come up with that $1 million because it costs me $1 million to operate those stores in losses. Then sure, then it makes sense. Otherwise, what you're doing is just cutting off another finger, and long term that doesn't play well for you. And you know what's going to happen? You're going to look back and say, "Gee, why did we close that store?" Because that does happen too.
That thought, I think, just draw it to a conclusion. We're probably going to have another conversation extending this thought as we go into 2023 proper. So I'd just like to thank Jeff and Walter for contributing to this discussion. Stay tuned for many more interesting conversations on RetailAID. Thank you all very much. Tune in next time. Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your organization. You can connect with me via my website, retailaid.ca, go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn and connect with me there. Please feel free to follow the experts on this podcast for more insights and to join in the conversation. I look forward to collaborating with you and playing an active part with your supply chain and business's transformation as you are inspired to think big, be bold, scale, adapt, and win.